US President Trump continues to attempt to bring about peace between Ukraine and Russia. His latest gambit is one of his most ambitious yet, a direct meeting with Vladimir Putin in Hungary. That nation is part of the European Union or EU, and Putin would have to fly into the airspace of several EU and NATO-aligned countries to get to Hungary. One nation has taken a stand. Poland has vowed to intercept Putin's jet and arrest him if he dares to fly into its territory. Russia's leader doesn't have permission to fly, Poland says, and Putin's entire Hungary meeting with Trump is now in jeopardy. A little over a month after it had to deal with Russia's drones entering its airspace, Poland has told Putin, in no uncertain terms, that its airspace is entirely closed to Russia. That doesn't just mean Russia's military aerial assets. Putin himself cannot travel over the country, and if he does, he risks being intercepted and arrested under a warrant from the International Criminal Court, or ICC. That's according to Poland's Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski. The Kyiv Post reports that Sikorski recently took part in a radio interview where he delivered his country's stern warning to the Russian president. Sikorski's comment was simple and to the point. "I cannot guarantee that an independent Polish court would not order the government to escort such a plane and hand over the suspect to The Hague," Sikorski declared. The Polish foreign minister is playing coy here. Merely suggesting that Putin could be arrested if he flies over Poland is enough to tell Russia's leader that the possibility is high. Sikorski may be intentionally trying to put the idea into the collective minds of the courts that he mentions. Or he may have already spoken to those courts and come up with a plan for what Poland would do if Putin is foolish enough to try to fly over its territory. Sikorski added, "I think the Russian side is aware of this when talking about Poland turning itself into a Putin no-fly zone. So if this summit takes place, hopefully with the participation of the victim of aggression, the plane will likely take a different route," Sikorski adds. That creates another question. If Poland is a no-go for Putin, what route could he take to reach Hungary? There certainly doesn't seem to be many real options. Putin isn't going to fly through Ukraine, which directly borders Hungary, because he knows that every Ukrainian jet and air defense system will be gunning for him the moment he crosses the border. Flying over Slovakia, which also borders Hungary, isn't an option because Putin would have to fly over Poland or Ukraine to get to Slovakia and arrive in Hungary from the north. As for the southeast, Romanian and Serbian airspace are options. The former is an EU and NATO member, making it very unlikely that it would approve Putin's flight. As for Serbia, Putin might have been able to fly over the country were it not for the fact that he'd have to cross Bulgarian airspace first. Again, that's a NATO and EU member nation. But hold on a second, it's only Poland that has said that it will arrest Putin if he tries to use its airspace. What about the likes of Romania and Bulgaria? As the Kyiv Post points out, every state, other than Poland, that Putin could ask to allow his plane safe passage is also an ICC member, just as Poland is. That doesn't necessarily mean that Romania and Bulgaria would divert Putin's plane and arrest him on sight, but it does mean they have the option, and with Poland leading the way, it's likely that neither Romania nor Bulgaria will be willing to allow a Russian flyover. Plus, like Poland, Romania and Bulgaria are signatories of the Rome Statute that underpins the entire ICC. That means they're duty-bound to arrest Putin under the ICC warrant if they get the opportunity. On the other hand, as Newsweek reports, the EU has taken an interesting decision to allow its member states to decide what they do when it comes to Putin's flight. The EU instituted a block-wide ban on all Russian planes entering EU airspace shortly after Putin invaded Ukraine. But when it comes to this potential trip to Hungary, the EU is perhaps looking at it as much from the perspective that the trip could lead to peace talks in the future as it is from the viewpoint of a Russian violation. So the EU is taking a hands-off approach. Newsweek reports that a spokesperson for the European Commission has already said that it's up to individual member states whether they maintain or lift the EU's flight ban on Russian aircraft. The spokesperson also pointed out that any meeting that moves forward just and lasting peace in Ukraine is welcome. Trump's meeting with Putin in Hungary could be seen as one of these steps closer to peace. Would that be enough to convince EU members and ICC signatory states to allow Putin passage? It's hard to say. Putin's only other option, and potentially the safest for the Russian leader, is to take a long route that passes over Turkey and several Balkan states to enter Hungary via the south. Turkey isn't a Rome Statute signatory nor an EU member, so it has those two things going for it from Putin's perspective. However, the country is a NATO member, and Russia has made no secret of its desire to dismantle NATO after Ukraine, so even Putin's best option is hardly safe. Speculation abounds as to how all of these other nations might react to Putin flying through their territory. Sikorski has made the Polish position clear. If Putin flies over Poland, he's going to get arrested. Russia, as you would expect, has reacted negatively to Sikorski's comments. On October 21st, UNN reported that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has come down hard on his Polish counterpart for the comments. Poland has committed terrorist acts by refusing to offer Putin safe passage over its territory. And as is Russia's way, Lavrov has also claimed that Poland's decision goes a step further. Apparently, Poland has justified a terrorist act by encouraging Ukraine to attack the Nord Stream pipeline. And now Lavrov claims Poland is gearing up to carry out such actions itself against Russia. The hypocrisy runs rife here. It was only a few minutes ago that we were telling you how Russia just sent drones into Polish airspace, so it's ridiculous that Lavrov is now trying to accuse Poland of committing a terrorist act. The accusation is irrelevant anyway. Every country has the right to choose who does and doesn't enter its airspace. Putin isn't exempt from international aviation law, as much as Lavrov might want to act as though he is. As for the terrorist act of a potential arrest, Poland will be acting under the auspices of the ICC. Just because Russia doesn't recognize that court as legitimate, that doesn't mean that Poland is doing anything wrong by following through on its obligation to arrest Putin as a war criminal under an ICC warrant if Russia's leader enters its territory. In short, Lavrov is talking nonsense. We'll dig into the reasons why when it comes to the ICC and what its warrant actually says in a moment. First, the question has to be asked, what does Sikorski's statement mean for the future of Putin's meeting with Trump in Hungary? We know that Hungary itself, which Newsweek notes is also an EU member, though it often finds itself at odds with the wider bloc, has guaranteed that Putin will be safe from arrest if he arrives on the country's territory. That's strange in itself. Hungary is also an ICC member, meaning it has the same obligation to arrest Putin as Poland and every other ICC member. Having said that, Hungary is in the process of leaving the ICC. Plus, it's also previously welcomed Israel's leader Benjamin Netanyahu onto its territory, despite Netanyahu having an ICC arrest warrant of his own. As a founding member of the ICC, Hungary is in the process of changing everything about how it deals with people like Putin. That's great for Russia's leader, and it's why Hungary was chosen as the location for the latest meeting with Trump. However, as Poland made abundantly clear, it's not being in Hungary that's Putin's problem, it's getting there. And at the time the news broke about Sikorski's comments, the entire summit between Trump and Putin was up in the air. No official date had been set, and even a pre-summit meeting between Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio had been postponed amid all the turmoil. There's breaking news about the state of this upcoming meeting that has been published as we create this video. We'll explain what that news is later. For now, let's come back to the ICC issue, which is what underpins Sikorski's comments and has been the impetus for the threats of arrest being levied at Putin. Just what has the ICC said about Putin? And how would an arrest of Russia's president even work? What would it mean for the future? We'll start with the first of those three questions. Based in The Hague, which is in the Netherlands, the ICC is, as its name implies, an international court. The ICC's website says that the organization investigates and, where warranted, tries individuals charged with the gravest crimes of concern to the international community: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. The majority of the world recognizes and actively participates in the ICC as signatories of the Rome Statute. This United Nations treaty essentially binds each signatory to follow through with arrests based on any warrants that the ICC issues. Right now, there are 125 nations considered as state parties to the Rome Statute. Poland is one of them. Technically, what this means is that Poland doesn't really have a choice over whether it arrests Putin or not. As an ICC member, Poland is obligated to do so under the Rome Statute. That brings us back to what the ICC has to say about Putin. None of it's good. There has been an ICC arrest warrant out for Russia's president for around 2.5 years. That warrant was made official on March 17, 2023, with the ICC stating that it wishes to arrest Putin for a specific set of war crimes committed during his invasion of Ukraine. Under Putin's guidance, the ICC says, Russia has been unlawfully deporting and transporting members of Ukraine's population, including children, since the war began. That's a war crime, and Putin bears individual criminal responsibility, both for being directly involved in these deportations and transportations and for maintaining so little control over Russia's military that he allowed these crimes to happen. That means Putin can't argue that he knew nothing about the crimes of which he stands accused. Even if he didn't know anything, which is unlikely, his failure to control Russia's military would make him guilty. There certainly seems to be no doubt that the crimes the ICC accuses Putin and his cronies of committing have actually happened. In June, The Guardian published a report on Ukraine's kidnapped children, noting that as many as 35,000 are missing and believed to be held in either Russia or the Russian-occupied portions of Ukraine. These children have been abducted from care homes, snatched from their parents, or taken because Russian soldiers killed their parents, the outlet says. The Guardian also notes that 1,366 of Ukraine's kidnapped children have managed to make it back to their own country, per the Ukrainian organization Bring Kids Back. As for the rest, Russia has refused multiple calls to release the children it's taken back to Ukraine and has even accused its enemy of staging a show on the topic of lost children. So Russia is denying that it has done anything. What else is new? Russia's reaction to the warrant the ICC issued for Putin also shouldn't come as a surprise. Ukraine World explored that reaction in April 2023. It added that beyond the children we've already mentioned, a minimum of 2.5 million Ukrainians have been displaced up to that point in Putin's invasion. That only lends more credibility to the ICC's charges. However, it's the very credibility that Russia questions. Its argument is that as a non-signatory of the Rome Statute, Russia, and thus its people, can't be held under ICC law. It's certainly true that Russia isn't a part of the ICC. It signed the Rome Statute in 2000, though it never officially ratified its status. In 2016, 2 years after Putin annexed Crimea, Russia officially withdrew from the ICC. Russia's propagandists and officials were quick to argue against the ICC's warrant, as Ukraine World points out. The chair of the Federation Council Committee on Constitutional Legislation, Andrei Klishas, said the warrants were absurd before he called for the immediate issuance of arrest warrants for all ICC judges in an outright ridiculous statement. Apparently, irony isn't one of Klishas's strong points. Favored Putin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev threatened Germany in particular with the aiming of all our means at the country if it arrested Putin. And other Russian propagandists reeled off the usual threats of destruction for any nation that crosses Russia or does anything against Putin. As for a more official response to the warrant, the Kremlin did get around to releasing a statement that wasn't just a series of outright threats. Russia, as well as several other states, do not recognize the jurisdiction of this court, and accordingly, any decisions of this kind are null and void for Russia in terms of law, the Kremlin said of the warrant back in 2023. It's fair to say that Russia wasn't happy. However, Russia's refusal to participate in the ICC doesn't absolve Putin from being arrested and tried for war crimes under the ICC banner. The Russian rule of law won't apply if the ICC manages to get its hands on Putin. Granted, the ICC can't compel Russia to hand Putin over due to Russia's status as a non-signatory, but if Putin enters the territory of an ICC member, Russia won't have any say in the matter. Poland has made that clear, and the ICC will be able to prosecute Putin for the crimes it says he's committed if Poland were to arrest Russia's leader. That brings us to how an arrest like this would even work. As Newsweek reported in 2023, the ICC itself doesn't maintain a police force that it can use to arrest people. Instead, it relies on its Rome Statute signatories to do that work for it, which doesn't always work out in the ICC's favor. Newsweek highlights the case of the former Sudanese leader Omar al-Bashir, who has 2 ICC arrest warrants but has managed to visit several ICC member states without being arrested. An obligation to arrest does not mean a guarantee, it seems. But theoretically, the arrest of Putin would be carried out like any other arrest. A nation's police force, likely a federal force or equivalent, would take Putin into custody and then hand him over to The Hague so he can stand trial. Granted, Poland's version would see it forcing Putin's plane to land if it enters Polish airspace, but Poland is well within its rights to do that while chasing an arrest under an ICC warrant. So the question isn't so much how the arrest would go down, it's what would happen afterward. There are several theories. Sky News spoke to military analyst Sean Bell not long after the ICC issued its warrant. He pointed out that the warrant, regardless of how justified it might be, might make it more difficult to convince Putin to come to the negotiating table when it comes to the Ukraine war. Anything that further isolates Putin's position has a risk. It risks him doubling down and focusing his determination to continue the conflict, claimed Bell. It doesn't seem to me that it's going to help to bring the war to an end anytime soon. Some might argue that Bell's words have come true, as it seems to be the situation that exists now. Trump wants to meet Putin in Hungary, but Poland says it won't allow that to happen because of the ICC warrant and Russia's recent actions in Poland. How much this blocks peace negotiations depends on how seriously you believe Putin has been taking these negotiations since they started in early 2025. The BBC also speculated that the ICC warrant would have no impact on Putin's approach to Ukraine back in 2023. Again, that's proven to be the case, as Russia hasn't for a moment reduced the intensity of its attacks on Ukraine because the ICC says that Putin should be arrested. But let's assume Putin is arrested. Though Russia has claimed that it would retaliate immediately, some think that the Kremlin actually wouldn't do a thing. One of those people is Olga Lautman, who is a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Lautman told Newsweek, "In the hypothetical case that Putin was to be arrested by an ICC member, I don't believe Russia would do anything. When it comes to Germany or any NATO state, Russia would take no action because they fully understand they are not prepared to have a direct confrontation with NATO. That's the big issue for Putin. Most of the ICC members that are willing to arrest him are also NATO members, including Poland. A Russian retaliation for the enforcement of a legitimate ICC warrant would see the country forced into a direct conflict with NATO. Whether that conflict would involve the US or not is up for debate. Like Russia, the US isn't a signatory to the Rome Statute, which means it isn't an ICC member. Should Putin be arrested by an ICC and NATO member on that nation's territory, forcing a Russian retaliation, the US could make the argument that the arrest is illegitimate. It could even claim that the arrest is an act of aggression that started a war, which may mean the US wouldn't be obligated to come to its NATO allies' aid as it normally would under Article 5 of the NATO Charter. All of this is speculative, but there is a possibility that the threat of a NATO reprisal for a Russian retaliation isn't what it once was. Let's come back to the statement that started it all, Sikorski's claim that Poland will arrest Putin if Russia's president enters its airspace. Earlier we told you that there was some breaking news related to Putin's meeting with Trump in Hungary. The news is that the summit is off. That's according to The Telegraph, which reported on October 21st that Trump has decided against meeting Putin face-to-face in any country at any point in the immediate future. It's unclear whether Poland's threat of ICC-backed arrest played a part in the decision. The Telegraph says that the meeting was called off after a phone call between US and Russian negotiators took a bad turn. Perhaps that turn involved the US refusing to put pressure on its allies to enable Putin's safe passage to Hungary. We can't know for sure, as neither the US nor Russia is revealing much more. So Putin won't be traveling to Hungary after all. However, that doesn't limit the power of the message that Poland has sent to Russia and its leader. Putin now knows that he is not only not welcome in EU airspace, but that at least one EU member is willing to arrest him. Perhaps others will follow. It's one thing to negotiate peace between Ukraine and Russia. It's quite another to ensure that peace is maintained. This has been the worry for Ukraine and many of its allies as peace talks have progressed, as they all know that what Putin says and what he does are often not the same. For peace to be sustained, Ukraine needs security guarantees, and now it looks like it's going to get them. European troops are ready to enter Ukraine, and the countdown begins right now. That's according to the UK, which heads the Coalition of the Willing. This collection of nations essentially amounts to Ukraine's security guarantee, as the coalition has said in the past that it's willing to do whatever it takes, up to and including the deployment of troops in Ukraine, to ensure any peace agreement is maintained. The UK's Defence Secretary John Healey has just reinforced that possibility. During a speech delivered in London on October 20th, Healey told listeners that peace is possible, before adding, "If President Trump can broker a peace, then we'll be ready to help secure that peace for the long term." What does secure that peace for the long term mean? Healey elaborated in the same speech as the BBC reports. Healey said that troops from the UK are ready to deploy, and they're not alone. He added that several members of the Coalition of the Willing are on board and revealed that plans have been in place for a deployment for a long time. The work of over 200 military planners from 38-plus nations over the last 6 months means that much of Europe is ready to go if it's given the signal. The UK in particular will spend big if a peace deal is reached in Ukraine. It's already anticipating spending well over £100 million, which amounts to about $133 million, to send troops into Ukraine, Healey declares. However, there is a small catch, though it's one that Ukraine will be delighted to hear. The UK and its partners will only commit their troops to the country if it's in Ukraine's best interests. It's the Ukrainian people who will decide how and what is negotiated during peace negotiations. If Russia attempts to push through a peace proposal to which Ukraine doesn't agree, the Coalition of the Willing will stand against it. That would mean no troops on Ukrainian soil as part of a peace deal, but it could also mean soldiers get stationed in Ukraine to battle against Putin. As an aside, Healey also mentioned that Ukraine has granted its soldiers some new powers in what's clearly an attempt to send another message to Putin. Warning that Putin views the UK as his number one enemy, Healey revealed that UK soldiers will now be allowed to shoot down any drones that invade the airspace of any of its military bases. This isn't asking permission before shooting. It's a shoot-on-sight order, and it comes after 4 British air bases, all of which are used by the US, reported mystery drone sightings in 2024. Right now, these new powers only extend to military sites. However, the BBC suggests that they may soon be extended to civilian locations such as airports if Russia continues to expand on the hybrid warfare tactics with which it targets NATO allies. What can we conclude from all of this? Well, European nations are ready to enter Ukraine under the banner of the Coalition of the Willing, and it will be the UK that leads the charge. That shouldn't come as a surprise. The UK has been leading the way in Europe when it comes to Ukraine for quite some time. The Coalition of the Willing is a perfect example. It was formed by the UK, Euromaidan press reports, and is an alliance of 26 nations that work together to provide security assistance to Ukraine independent of the existing NATO structures. That last part is important. Amid the turbulence caused by the rocky relationship Ukraine has experienced with the US since the beginning of 2025, Ukraine having access to such security mechanisms could prove vital to its long-term future. Ukraine hopes that the US will work alongside it to ensure a fair peace, but there are no guarantees. Under the UK's guidance, the Coalition of the Willing has gathered several European Union or EU members, along with a few non-EU countries. Together, they're working on training and equipping a combined force that can be deployed to Ukraine to ensure the nation's sovereignty in the aftermath of the war with Russia. This coalition isn't just about supporting Ukraine right now. It wants to ensure that Ukraine will continue to exist well into the future, no matter what Russia tries to do. In March, the Atlantic Council published an article discussing how the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer had started holding virtual meetings with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss plans for the then nascent Coalition of the Willing. The plans started coming together quickly, the outlet notes, and the coalition has gone from being a nice idea to a very real threat to Putin's ambitions in Ukraine since March. The UK's trailblazing when it comes to this coalition appears to be par for the course. The Atlantic Council notes that it's often the UK that makes the first move when it comes to new ways to support Ukraine, with the EU then following. Examples include the UK being the first European nation to offer long-range cruise missiles and modern battle tanks to Ukraine, which other nations have done since. Perhaps the UK no longer being part of the EU thanks to the 2016 Brexit referendum means that it has less tape to cut through in order to offer aid to Ukraine, or the country may simply be quicker off the draw than its EU counterparts. The UK certainly gets something out of all of this. By supporting Ukraine, post-Brexit Britain has demonstrated that it remains a force in international affairs and a major contributor to European security, the Atlantic Council points out. British support for the Ukrainian war effort has also made it possible to overcome Brexit-related tensions and build new partnerships with key European countries such as Germany, France, and Italy. Ukraine won't care about the other reasons why the UK is so keen to help it secure its sovereignty. All it cares about is the commitment, and the UK has just made sure Ukraine and Russia know that it's ready to go when called upon. In even better news for Ukraine, it seems very unlikely that the UK is going to waver from its solid showcasing of support. We can see that in the January creation of the 100-year partnership between Ukraine and the UK. Though obviously named to grab a few headlines, this partnership is intended to demonstrate that the UK believes that Ukraine will be a sovereign nation for many years to come. For Ukraine to be a sovereign nation, that means Russia will have failed in its invasion. A century of partnership certainly suggests that Ukraine doesn't have anything to worry about when it comes to support for its fight. However, Ukraine will also know that the will of a country's people goes a long way to determining what the country does. It's willpower that is the secret weapon and the driving force in Ukraine right now, as it's fighting so hard against Russia because the country's people don't want to go back to the Soviet Dark Ages. In the UK, the will of the people seems to lie with Ukraine. At least that's according to findings published by YouGov, which is a global data company that makes gathering public opinions its stock in trade. It found that fewer of the UK public believe a peace deal that is fair to Ukraine is less likely now than it was at the beginning of the year. 66% of the public feel that Ukraine may be pushed into ceding some of its territory, and importantly, 57% of the UK population would react negatively in this scenario. In other words, most of the UK believes that Ukraine shouldn't be forced to cede any territory. The same pollster found that 65% of people in the UK believe Russia would launch another war against Ukraine within a decade of signing a peace deal, which highlights the importance of the Coalition of the Willing and its security guarantees. And perhaps most importantly for Ukraine, 80% of people in the UK say they want Ukraine to win the war. Of that 80%, 87% said that they care either a fair amount or a great deal about the outcome, which means that a total of 69% of people in the UK both want Ukraine to win and care that it does. This is impressive public support from a country that isn't fighting a direct war with Russia, and it's support that means the tide of public opinion is unlikely to tear the UK away from its work for Ukraine anytime soon. All of this brings us back to the Coalition of the Willing and the UK's role as the leader of that coalition. Healey isn't just hinting that the UK is ready to deploy in Ukraine, he's outright saying it, and he's also confirmed that several members of the coalition that the UK created will join it in putting boots on the ground as soon as a suitable peace deal is agreed and Ukraine is ready to accept a proper security guarantee. What would this force look like? Though Healey confirms that plans have been in place for months and that the creation of these plans has involved at least 200 people, he doesn't tell us how the Coalition of the Willing would deploy. It's likely Healey is staying tight-lipped on the subject because any deployment would have to be made in cooperation with Ukraine, and Ukraine may not want to give away what the coalition has planned just yet. Still, we can speculate, and there are several ideas floating around about what the deployment might look like. Back in August, which was when the Coalition of the Willing began discussing the possibility of sending troops into Ukraine in earnest, DW published an article in which it looked at what a European troop deployment in Ukraine might end up looking like. One suggestion is that European soldiers could serve the role of peacekeepers, much as United Nations troops do all around the world. However, that concept assumes a level of neutrality on Europe's side that doesn't exist, says Raphael Loss of the European Council on Foreign Relations. A peacekeeping role is the closest to the UN system. These forces observe warring parties in a tense situation after a ceasefire, Loss told DW. Conceptually, I don't think that role would fit in with what the Ukrainians want and how Europeans see themselves. They are not neutral in this conflict and want to be seen to be on Ukraine's side. Still, if the peacekeeper route was taken, this would likely involve the deployment of a few thousand lightly armored troops along the contact lines. Those soldiers would act as observers and would be tasked with sounding the alarm if Russia violates a ceasefire or peace treaty. Another option, which DW says has been under discussion since at least August, is to send a combat-ready force into Ukraine. Combat-ready doesn't mean that this force would engage Russia directly. In other words, Europe isn't going to send soldiers to fight alongside Ukraine during the war as it currently stands. Instead, these troops would enter Ukraine during peacetime and will be ready to fight back if Russia tries to start a future invasion of Ukraine. The idea here is to create a deterrent. Many of the soldiers that would make up this combat-ready force would not only be very capable, but they will also come from NATO-aligned nations. If Russia strikes against these soldiers, that would give NATO all the justification it needs to strike back. Up to 150,000 soldiers would be needed for this type of deployment, which is a tall order. DW reports that the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimates that Europe collectively has about 1.5 million troops, meaning a tenth of that force would need to enter and stay in Ukraine if the combat-ready approach is taken. Back in September, the Atlantic Council also made the point that what the Coalition of the Willing actually does in Ukraine depends on how willing its members are to do anything. The UK may have said that it's happy to deploy troops, and it's hinted that many other European nations feel the same, but what that deployment eventually looks like is subject to disagreements among the coalition's members. Europe's collective desire to avoid a direct military confrontation with the Kremlin places serious limits on the potential scope of any reassurance force, the outlet says. However, this cautious approach does not mean that a European military presence in Ukraine would be entirely useless. The Atlantic Council adds that beyond the impact of troops on the ground, the Coalition of the Willing might also be able to provide Ukraine with aerial support. Think something akin to NATO's air policing missions, which involves the monitoring of Allied skies for threats. The Coalition of the Willing could do the same, perhaps acting as a reporting and, if needed, a response network to ensure that Russia doesn't get away with pulling the hybrid warfare tactics it's currently trying with NATO. Disagreement within the coalition may be a limiting factor. Another is the big elephant in the room. Everything that the UK just said that it's willing to deliver hinges on Ukraine and Russia coming to terms on a peace deal. And it stands to reason that the deployment of European troops into Ukraine under any capacity would be subject to Russian approval as part of that deal. Talk about European forces heading to Ukraine has arisen in the past, and Russia has always said that it wouldn't approve. That was the case in August when The Guardian reported that Russia had insisted that it should have a veto on any post-war support offered to Ukraine. That request came in the aftermath of Putin's meeting with the US President Donald Trump in Alaska, and it threw a massive wrench into the works of Europe's forces, providing a security guarantee to Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that any European proposals to deploy troops into Ukraine would amount to foreign intervention, which Lavrov says is unacceptable to Russia. Do you remember the neutrality issue we mentioned with the peacekeeping plan earlier? This is that issue coming to a head. What this means for the UK and its partners is that they might have to make a choice. In a perfect world, a fair peace deal is agreed, and Russia says that it's okay with Europe sending troops into Ukraine in whatever capacity is needed to ensure the peace is kept. That ideal scenario seems unlikely, which gives rise to a second potential scenario. The Coalition of the Willing goes in anyway, whether Putin likes it or not. The potential for massive escalation exists with this scenario. However, it may end up being what the Coalition of the Willing has to do, because a peace deal doesn't seem to be coming anytime soon. Healey made his comments on October 20th specifically because Trump was planning to meet with Putin in Hungary to discuss terms of peace. That's why he mentions Trump playing a role in a peace agreement. The US president has flip-flopped on what this peace could look like over the past few weeks. On September 23rd, Trump seemed to be all in on Ukraine, claiming that the country is capable of winning all of Ukraine back in its original form. But on the eve of the Hungary meeting with Putin, Trump started suggesting that a peace deal would require the freezing of the current battle lines. That would essentially mean that Ukraine cedes most of the DONBAS region to Putin, which Ukraine isn't going to allow to happen. And in the wake of a meeting with Zelensky, where he suggested this land ceding, Trump told journalists, "I don't think they will," when asked whether Ukraine can win the war. "They could still win it. I never said they would win it. War is a very strange thing. A lot of bad things happen," Trump added. Trump can't seem to make up his mind. Ultimately, it doesn't seem like it's going to matter. The proposed peace talks in Hungary have been called off altogether, The Telegraph reported on October 21st. And the reason, the outlet claims, is that Russia refused to accept the ceasefire terms presented to it by the United States. Prior to the Hungary meeting, Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke on the phone. The discussion ended up becoming tense, The Telegraph says, with Lavrov stating that Russia wasn't prepared to accept the American proposal that the current front line be frozen as part of a ceasefire. The US appears to have put a spin on this entire exchange. The White House described the tense phone call as productive. It also claimed, "Therefore, an additional in-person meeting between the Secretary and Foreign Minister is not necessary, and there are no plans for President Trump to meet with President Putin in the immediate future." Given that the meeting in Hungary has been all over the news for the last few days, this seems like a strange statement to make. Far more likely is that Russia has refused to back down from its maximalist demands, perhaps sensing weakness in the US being willing to potentially push Ukraine into ceding territory. The peace that some in Europe might have hoped would come from the meeting between Putin and Trump isn't going to happen. Negotiations are back to where they've been for months. What this means for the UK and its coalition of the willing is unclear. Europe might be ready to deploy, but no peace deal means no opportunity to do so. That is, unless the coalition is willing to incur whatever wrath of Russia awaits it by deploying into Ukraine while the war is still active. If that happens, would Russia back down, or would a Europe-wide war be triggered? Only time will tell.
Ukraine is no longer just fighting along the front lines, battling Russian forces in occupied regions like Luhansk and Donetsk. Now it's fighting a second war, a secret war over the border and inside Russia itself. In western, central and even eastern regions of Russia, Ukrainian drones and missiles are an increasingly common sight, raining down fire from above on important military buildings and pieces of infrastructure. As these attacks become more frequent, it becomes significantly harder for the Russian President Vladimir Putin to tell his people that everything is fine. Bit by bit, the illusion of safety he strives so hard to create is being obliterated, and countless Russians are waking up to the harsh reality of this conflict. This phenomenon is occurring throughout Russia, but is particularly prevalent in the Bryansk region, which sits in western Russia, sandwiched between Ukraine to the south and Belarus to the north. Home to more than 1.1 million people and stretching out across 13,458 square miles, Bryansk's close proximity to Ukraine has made it a popular target for Kyiv's forces. And as the area comes under increasing pressure, local officials are finding it harder and harder to convince the region's people that all is well and they have nothing to fear. Only days ago, on the night of October 20, the most recent Ukrainian raid on Bryansk took place, and it's fascinating to look at how Kremlin officials reported the raid compared to how local news platforms and media organizations within Bryansk actually covered the incident. In Moscow, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a simple statement acknowledging that a mere 2 Ukrainian drones allegedly passed over the border from the Chernihiv region of Ukraine and into Bryansk before being swiftly shot down by Russian Army air defense systems. The official statement went on to note that there were no injuries, no deaths, and no damage in the area. If that report is accurate, then it sounds like this was an utterly insignificant incident, barely even worth reporting on or discussing in any further detail. The Russian military spotted a couple of drones and shot them down, and that was that. At least, that's what the Kremlin wants everyone to think. However, digging a little deeper into this story, local Bryansk news agencies paint a very different picture of events, a picture that's much more chaotic and concerning from Russia's point of view. Reports from the town of Klintsy, which is home to around 60,000 people and situated in the far southwest corner of the Bryansk region, just a short distance from the borders to both Belarus and Ukraine, state that the night was one of drama and fear for the local population. According to their accounts, air raid warnings and sirens rang out throughout the night, combined with the sounds of anti-aircraft cannons and mobile machine gun crews firing into the sky in a desperate attempt to bring Ukrainian drones down to earth. Footage captured by locals and shared on the Astra Telegram channel at least partly confirms this, as it shows the air raid warning message repeating on a Klintsy resident television. Local reports also state that there were in fact several instances of drone impacts and damage to local buildings, and one resident, a male teenager, was even injured at the scene. A local Telegram news channel, entitled We Listen to Clincy, provided an in-depth account of the evening's events. Overnight, Ukrainian Nazis attacked the city of Clincy using fixed-wing UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. As a result of the barbaric actions of the Ukrainian armed forces, a teenager born in 2010 sustained injuries. An ambulance crew provided the boy with all the necessary medical care at the scene. Windows were damaged in 2 apartment buildings, 3 civilian vehicles were hit and damaged by shrapnel. Details will come after authorities inspect the scene in the morning. Even the region's governor, Alexander Bogomaz, could not cover up what had happened. Posting on his own Telegram channel, Bogomaz wrote, "More vile attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces against civilians. A detailed official inspection of the damage will be carried out in the morning." These two contrasting versions of events could hardly be more different. On the one hand, the Russian Defense Ministry statement suggests that nothing of note occurred in Bryansk on October 20. On the other hand, numerous local news agencies and even the regional governor were posting about vile attacks and Ukrainian Nazis bombarding their region, damaging vehicles, buildings and more. Those who have been following the war closely for some time will already know that this is the exact sort of scenario that plays out on a regular basis. So often, when Ukraine launches a successful strike of any kind on Russian soil, the Kremlin's propaganda machine instantly activates, using any means at its disposal to cover up the truth. There have been numerous defense ministry statements claiming that only minimal damage was incurred, or in some instances, no damage at all was sustained to military sites, refineries, ports, or production plants, despite reams of image and video evidence to the contrary. It's all part of the classic Kremlin playbook. By hiding the truth, twisting the narrative and masking the facts, Putin can continue to fool at least some of the Russian population into believing that he's completely in control, that the special military operation is still going to plan, and that their homeland is just as powerful as it's ever been. More importantly, it creates the aforementioned illusion of safety. It makes Russian communities feel more at ease with the idea that the war won't affect them personally. That way, even those who may have doubts about the value or purpose of the conflict can still feel that the Kremlin is looking out for them, and that they can get on with their lives in a state of relative peace and security, calmly confident that no enemy drones or bombs will suddenly appear in their hometowns. Typically, regional governors and other lower-level officials around Russia are encouraged to toe the line and follow the Kremlin's example. They repeat and reinforce the ideas that all is well, everyone is safe, and a big Russian victory is right around the corner. It's a technique snatched straight from the pages of George Orwell's seminal work 1984. But this is no novel. It's the real world where the Kremlin's carefully crafted illusion is being well and truly shattered by Ukrainian forces. As evident from the recent incident in Bryansk, even officials and media organizations that would usually simply echo the Kremlin's calm statements are now breaking rank and sharing their versions of events in gritty detail. The reason for this is most likely quite simple. Officials in regions like Bryansk are simply no longer able to keep up the pretense that everything is fine in their territories. They're suffering too often and too overtly, and they know that they would look foolish in the eyes of the people that elect them if they tried to cover up the facts. Earlier on October 20, for example, another attack occurred, leaving a Russian serviceman named Ivan Slabchenko with multiple wounds, according to another Astra report. The news outlet wrote on Telegram, "A Russian armed forces serviceman was wounded in the Bryansk region, according to Astra sources. In the Suzmesky district, serviceman Ivan Slabchenko was hospitalized with multiple wounds. Astra sources in the region's medical services reported. He was injured in an attack by an FPV drone. Local authorities usually do not report injuries among military personnel." As the post notes, local officials typically don't go to the trouble of talking much, or at all, about injuries to military personnel. But in this case, plenty of people across Bryansk are aware of what happened to Ivan Slabchenko, because they're starting to see, hear and feel the effects of Ukraine's attacks more deeply and pertinently in their everyday lives. Numerous other incidents have been recorded in the region in recent weeks. One recent attack, for example, involved at least one Ukrainian drone striking an agricultural facility in the village of Trubchavesk. No humans were killed or injured in the attack, but an unspecified number of livestock and chickens were killed, with the facility primarily used for raising cattle and poultry for meat. This appears to be something of an outlier as far as Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil are concerned. The The majority of the country's deep strikes in Russia focus exclusively on sites of military importance, like command posts, headquarters, and airfields, or other critical pieces of infrastructure that help to power the Russian economy and raise funds for the Kremlin's war machine, such as oil refineries, fuel storage facilities, and power stations. Kyiv is not in the habit of hitting targets like farming facilities, so it may be that this attack was either accidental or that Ukrainian forces had some unknown reason for targeting this site in particular. Either way, it's just one of the many confirmed attacks across the region, and almost all of the others are more in line with Ukraine's usual strategy and tactical target selection. In late September, for example, reports emerge of a Ukrainian drone and missile strike on the Electro-Detal factory in the Bryansk town of Karachev. The factory reportedly produces vital components for the Kremlin's military machine, including electrical connectors that are used in aircraft antennas and various pieces of military hardware. In a detailed Telegram post, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine claimed full responsibility for the strike. An enterprise that manufactures products for military needs was hit. As part of reducing the capabilities of the enemy's occupation army, on September 29, units of the missile forces and artillery of the armed forces of Ukraine, in cooperation with other components of the defense forces, launched 4 products during a missile strike at the Karachev plant, Electro-Detal, Karachev City, Bryansk region, Russia. The flight range is over 240 kilometers. Karachevsky plant, Electro-Detal, produces a variety of electrical connectors for military and general industrial applications, including low-frequency, high-frequency, and combined connectors. The products are used in aerospace, electronics, instrument making, and other industries. These include, in particular, connectors for printed circuit boards, military equipment, aircraft, antennas, base stations, and other systems, as well as components for various measuring instruments. Explosions and a fire were recorded on the territory of the facility. Images and videos also soon spread across social media, revealing the full extent of the damage as thick black clouds of smoke filled the skies and the sounds of explosions rang around the town. Days later, an even more ferocious wave of attacks hit the region, with Ukrainian forces focusing on 3 distinct targets dotted across Bryansk, all related to the energy sector: a major thermal power plant in Klintsy, an electrical substation, and an oil pipeline pumping station. As Astra reported, on the night of October 6, the Bryansk region was hit by a massive missile attack. At least 2 Ukrainian missiles hit the thermal power plant in Klintsy. Due to damage to the gas distribution center, gas supplies to the plant were cut off. As of that night, more than half of the city's residents were left without heat, according to sources in the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations. The type of missiles used in the attack is unknown to Astra. Astra previously geolocated footage from Klintsy after the shelling. The Klintsov-Sakaya Thermal Power Plant, TPP, is a gas-fired combined heat and power plant in the city of Klintsy, Bryansk Oblast. It's the city's main source of heat. Additionally, the A10 Steel Horse Line dispatch station in the Bryansk region was attacked again overnight. This is a linear production and control station belonging to Transneft Druzhba JSC. The station was previously attacked on September 22, as reported by Astra. Additionally, the NATO Povichi electrical substation was attacked, causing power outages in 2 districts for an hour. 3 targets taken out in a span of a single night. Tens of thousands of people left without heat in their homes. Countless residents watching from the windows as Ukrainian missiles soared across the skies and fires lit up the sky. All over Russia, similar stories are playing out. And with so many people literally seeing these attacks happen with their own eyes, and many defying the Kremlin's law by capturing the incidents on camera and sharing the footage online, it's no longer possible for Putin and his countless obedient officials to act like everything is all right. Russia is under attack, and an increasingly large part of the population can see it, especially in Bryansk, which is, according to some reports, one of the hardest hit regions of them all. This is undoubtedly due to the fact that, as mentioned earlier on, it's situated so close to Ukraine, plus the fact that it's home to various important pieces of energy infrastructure, including those high-value targets that Ukraine has gone into the habit of taking out in recent months. In addition, large parts of Bryansk's territory are covered in thick woodland and dense wetlands, providing ideal cover for Ukrainian commando raids and covert attacks. As well as the incidents detailed earlier on, the region also suffered another recent drone and cruise missile strike to the Bryansk city power plant and nearby transformers, severing the supply of electricity to more than 1 million Russian citizens for several days. Soon after, a salvo of precision-guided US-made artillery rockets hit a critical node of the Druzhba pipeline, not far from the village of Unetcha. Ukraine has also established operational forces behind enemy lines, attacking Russian infrastructure from within and catching the enemy off guard. On October 19, according to the Kyiv Post, saboteurs operating as part of the partisan Atesh movement reportedly used incendiary devices to destroy a communications tower in the Zhukov border district. Open-source intelligence analysts later found evidence to suggest that several nearby support buildings had also been caught up in the ensuing fires, with Russian border troops in the region quickly cut off from their real-time surveillance and radio links used for monitoring almost 100 miles of the Ukraine-Russia border. Once again, Governor Bogomaz had plenty to say about the attack, choosing his words carefully to paint Ukrainian forces in the worst possible light. Tonight, Ukrainian terrorists attempted another dirty trick in our rear areas, sabotaging communications infrastructure in Zhukov district. This cowardly act left our border guards without vital links for hours, endangering our troops and civilians alike. We will hunt down these saboteurs and restore order. Bryansk will not bow to Kyiv's aggression. Back in late September, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces also revealed astonishing video footage showing an extremely rare incident in which a Russian Air Force Mi-8 transport assault helicopter was shot out of the air by a FPV drone strike. Open source researchers once more got to work to figure out where this incident actually happened, with many concluding that the video was captured in the Klimovo district of Bryansk, barely 12 miles from the border with Ukraine. Even going back to 2024, the Bryansk region was still one of Kyiv's top targets at the time. In October of last year, for instance, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces announced a successful drone attack on an enormous ammunition depot close to the town of Karachev in Bryansk, where Russia was said to be stockpiling huge amounts of North Korean artillery shells, as well as missiles, glide bombs and more. According to Ukraine's reports, some of the munitions were simply sitting out in the open, revealing how utterly unprepared Russian forces were for an attack of this kind. In a Facebook post detailing the incident, the General Staff wrote, "Last night, units of the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, jointly with other components of the Defense Forces, conducted a strike on the 67th Arsenal of the Main Missile and Artillery Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation in the Bryansk region. According to the available information, the arsenal stored ammunition for missile and artillery systems, including those delivered from North Korea, as well as glide bombs. Much of the ammunition was stored in the open. Explosions were recorded on the territory of the arsenal. It's reported that local authorities have blocked the road near the arsenal. The results of the combat operation are being updated. Striking such arsenals creates serious logistical problems for the Russian army, thus significantly reducing the offensive capabilities of the occupiers on threatened axes." Ever since then, Bryansk has suffered an increasing array of similar strikes, and they're occurring more regularly than ever before, with Governor Bogomaz recently claiming, "The quantity of strikes has tripled. It's more than ever before. This is how they, Ukrainian forces, show their true colors, the faces of fascists." While Bogomaz is clearly using the most evocative and ludicrous language he can possibly think of to keep the people on side, his statements prove one crucial thing. He, like many other Russian governors and officials, is no longer in a position where he can maintain the myth that Russia is still a safe, secure place to be. He's forced to admit that Ukrainian attacks have happened, are ongoing, and will continue to occur in the weeks and months ahead for as long as the war goes on. The more Russian people hear that sort of talk from their elected officials and regional governments, the more fearful and frustrated they're going to become. And that's exactly what Ukraine wants. As well as working hard to deal damage to high-value targets all over Russia's regions, Kyiv's forces also want to bring the war home to the Russian people, to make them see what's really happening, to smash through the lies and the propaganda of the Kremlin, and perhaps even, eventually, to sow some seeds of discontent, rage and rebellion among the population. Because the angrier the Russian people become, the harder it will be for Putin to placate them. From the moment he invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has been obsessed with the Donbas. Scratch that. that obsession started long before 2022, as the Donbas was also one of Putin's main targets when he launched his initial campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014. That year saw Russia illegally annex Crimea, but fail in the Donbas. Now, Putin is back to finish the job. The big question is why? And that question will be answered in this video, which reveals the true reasons behind Putin's fixation on this one Ukrainian region. But to understand the reasons, it's important to first explain what the Donbas actually is. The Kyiv Independent provides a good basic rundown in an article where it points out that the word Donbas is actually short for Donetsk Coal Basin. That alone hints at the industrial importance of the region, at least historically, and the Donbas moniker extends beyond the territories many might expect. Those who've been keeping up with the Ukraine war likely know that Luhansk and Donetsk are part of the Donbas. These are two of the oblasts on which Putin has placed most of his focus since he launched his 2022 invasion. Russia currently occupies 99% of Luhansk and around 3/4 of Donetsk, highlighting how these oblasts are key to Putin's campaign. Collectively, Al Jazeera said in August, Russia holds about 88% of the Donbas region. However, the Donbas also incorporates the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and based on some historical definitions, includes parts of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and parts of the Rostov Oblast in Russia. Still, it's Luhansk and Donetsk that grab all of the headlines, and there's a good reason why. These two regions make up the core of the Donbas, the Kyiv Independent claims, and they've served as economic powerhouses for decades. That was as true during the Soviet occupation of Ukraine as it has been for Ukraine since it gained its independence, as Luhansk and Donetsk are crucial to Ukraine's steel, coal, machinery, and also agricultural industries. With that, there's a big hint about one of the reasons why Putin is so obsessed with the Donbas. However, the first reason to cover is perhaps the one that's most directly related to the war Putin is waging in Ukraine. Russia's leader wants the Donbas so much because the region is an absolute fortress. Right now, Ukraine is using that fortress to defend itself, with the Donbas being a major line of defense that Ukraine is using to stop Russia's forces from reaching Kyiv. For Russia, claiming the Donbas also means taking control of the fortress Ukraine is using so well, which in turn makes it much more difficult for Ukraine to launch meaningful counter-offensives. As TVP World points out, the key cities of Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk all lend themselves to the Donbas's reputation as a region that's incredibly difficult to assault. Collectively, those cities, along with several others, make up what has become known as the Fortress Belt. Russia believes that this collapse of this belt will spell the end of Ukraine's brave defense. At least that's according to The Conversation, which published a piece in August that also pointed out that the fortress belt runs for about 31 miles from the previously mentioned city of Sloviansk in the north of Donetsk to the city of Kostiantinuka to the south. The Conversation quotes a Russian outlet named URA, which claims that the Donetsk fortress belt is the last serious line of defense of the Ukrainian armed forces. Beyond it, Kyiv has no other prepared lines of defense to Zaporizhia and the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russian army can advance to the Dnieper River. Though this claim should be taken with a grain of salt, given that it comes from a Russian source, the fact does remain that retaining the fortress belt is huge for Ukraine. That's why Ukraine has spent so much time making that belt a death trap for Russia's soldiers. The many fortifications that make up the fortress belt are defended by trenches, enormous minefields and anti-tank barriers. Ukrainian drones patrol constantly, and they're primed to attack whenever they get a sniff of a Russian troop deployment or mechanized unit. Ukraine has been strengthening all of these fortifications since Russia's initial foray into the Donbas in 2014, and they've proven very effective. Russia's military has experienced over 1.13 million casualties since the Ukraine war began, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. A huge percentage of that number will have occurred during Russia's constant assaults on Ukraine's Donbas fortifications. Claiming the Donbas would clear away these fortifications, meaning Russia may lose far fewer troops in future assaults. It would also clear a pathway into central Ukraine, where Russia's advance could end up being much quicker without the heavily fortified belt in its way. As Kirill Martynov, who is the editor-in-chief of the Novaya Gazeta, told Current Time, Ukraine has also invested heavily into the defense of the Donbas, and particularly Donetsk. The demands on Ukraine to hand over the remaining parts of the Donetsk region are unrealistic from the point of view of Ukraine's future defense capabilities, Martynov says. Putin has been trying to conquer the Donetsk region for 11 years, and handing over to him those fortified areas that remain under Ukrainian control is effectively a path to Kharkiv and Dnipro. So, Putin has a very practical reason for wanting the Donbas. He sees the entire region as the key to continuing Russia's advance deeper into Ukraine, and with Donetsk fortress belt under Russia's control, Putin believes that this deeper advance would happen faster and with fewer casualties than the one in the Donbas. Add having a fortress belt to call his own into the mix, and Putin has a very clear strategic interest in this region of Ukraine. But strategy isn't the only reason why Putin is obsessed with the Donbas. One could even argue that it isn't a reason for obsession at all, given that it's logical for Russia to be trying to break down one of Ukraine's most formidable series of fortifications. No, there are other reasons why Putin is so hell-bent on the Donbas, and the next one harkens back to something hinted at earlier in the video. The Donbas is an economic powerhouse. The region has served as the heart of the Ukrainian economy for much of its modern history, with the previously mentioned coal and metallurgical industries being especially massive. In 2013, which was the year before Putin first attempted to annex the region, these industries contributed to the Donbas having a regional gross domestic product or GDP of around $27 billion. Going back to before 2014, the Center for Economics and Business Research adds that the Donbas accounted for roughly 15.7% of Ukraine's total GDP. It was also home to 14.7% of the Ukrainian population prior to Russia's first annexation attempt. These aren't small numbers. Russia's actions in the Donbas were having an effect on Ukraine's economy long before the 2022 invasion too, the Kyiv Independent reports. According to the Center for Economics and Business Research, the conflict cost Ukraine up to $14.6 billion per year between 2014 and 2020, totaling around $102 billion in total losses. But the economic factor goes deeper than that. It's not just about what Russia can cost Ukraine that has Putin so obsessed. Russia's leader has his sights set on the Donbas because the region has enormous potential. Rare earth minerals are becoming more valuable by the year, and Ukraine is home to tons of them. Around 5% of the world's total of critical raw materials are in Ukraine, the BBC reports, including 19 million tons of proven graphite reserves, about a third of Europe's lithium reserves, and 7% of the continent's titanium. These are just a handful of examples, as Ukraine also has vast deposits of lead, copper, uranium, beryllium, cobalt, silver, nickel, manganese, and a host of other rare metals. Take one guess where a huge proportion of these valuable minerals happens to be. The answer is Donbas, and so is Russia, literally, thanks to its occupation of much of the region. Analysts estimate that the Donbas contains around 40% of Ukraine's critical mineral resources, part of a broader treasure trove of the country's mineral wealth valued between $1.5 to $1.8 trillion. There's a small caveat here in that not all of the region's reserves will be accessible, regardless of who controls the Donbas. Still, this is a massive number, and it highlights the fact that the Donbas is a treasure trove that Putin is desperate to crack open. The US certainly recognizes the value of Ukraine's mineral wealth. It signed a deal with Ukraine that sees the two countries creating a reconstruction investment fund that will use the country's mineral reserves to rebuild the country after the war. The US, of course, will have ways to profit from this fund, such as providing developers and infrastructure experts to oversee the reconstruction. Putin is nowhere near as subtle in his efforts to exploit the Donbas and its resources. He just wants to control the entire region because that would mean everything that lies beneath the Donbas lands would belong to Russia. Right now, Russia's occupation of much of the Donbas means that it's sitting on about 40% of Ukraine's total mineral reserves, Al Jazeera reports. That's money that Putin would love to pump back into the Russian economy, following a war that's already cost his nation around $211 billion, according to Social Europe. That seems to be a conservative estimate, especially as Ukraine believes that each day of the war costs Russia about $1 billion to wage. Whatever the real figure may be, and Russia's reluctance to share accurate statistics makes that figure difficult to determine, control of the Donbas would go a long way toward Putin making good on all of the economic harm he's caused to his country. And that leads to the third major reason why Putin is obsessed with the Donbas. He believes that the entire region is already a part of Russia. Putin has long used centuries-old history to justify Russia's Ukraine invasion, and the Donbas is no different. TVP World notes that the roots of Russia's claim to the region lie in the 18th century, when Catherine the Great expanded Russia's European conquest towards the Balkans. This expansion was dubbed New Russia, which eventually morphed into Russian world, and Ukraine was very much caught up in it. Putin himself brought up the Russian world concept following the annexation of Crimea. Given that he attempted to annex the Donbas during that same period of aggression, it's safe to assume he wants to apply the concept to Ukraine's embattled region. Of course, Putin tends to be happy to ignore history before Russia happened to control Ukraine, as well as ignore the world events such as the collapse of the Soviet Union that led to Ukraine becoming independent. Those kinds of events don't factor into Putin's warped view of global history. It would be inconvenient to his goals if he allowed them to. Russia's president has happily created and leaned on several myths to explain why the Donbas should be part of the Russian Federation. One of the most enduring of these myths, the Kyiv Independent says, is the idea that the Donbas naturally belongs to Russia because a large percentage of the region's population speaks Russian. The speaking Russian part of this argument seems to be relatively sound. The language is still fairly widespread in Ukraine. At least it was in 2004 when the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology conducted a public opinion poll, which found that up to 46% of Ukrainians use Russian at home. The Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts had especially high proportions of Russian-speaking people, at 93% and 89% of their populations respectively. The problem with these numbers, which Putin is all too happy to parrot, is that they don't tell the full story. Yes, large portions of the Donbas population speak Russian, but that doesn't mean they consider themselves Russian. The same survey that we mentioned earlier also found that only 39% of the people living in Donetsk in 2004 considered themselves Russian. Luhansk admittedly had 55% of its people state they were Russian, which is a slim majority. Still, these numbers show that the Donbas isn't as Russian as Putin would like the world to believe. These are also statistics from over 2 decades ago. Fast forward to May of this year, and the Ukrainian think tank, the Razumkov Center, conducted an interesting poll. It quizzed members of Ukraine's Russian-speaking population about their opinions of Russia, finding that 82% viewed the Russian Federation negatively. Putin's claims to be on a crusade to save Ukraine's Russian-speaking population. The reality seems to be that most of that population doesn't want to be saved, which appears to include many of those living in the Donbas. Russia hasn't done itself any favors if it's trying to win the hearts and minds of the Donbas people either. Almost 3 years of constant assaults on the region have devastated its cities and wrecked its infrastructure. Water supplies in particular have taken a beating. Many in the Donbas now only have the option of drinking bottled water because their in-home supplies aren't usable. As one woman from Luhansk told the Kyiv Independent, "Because the water that comes out of the tap is yellow, smelly and bad, we buy drinking water, but it's not cheap." In Donetsk, the water problem is so severe that it's all that many people can think about, claims a member of the Slavmavka partisan group operating in the region. In Donetsk, in the Kirovsky district, we've been almost completely without water. Before, at least a thin trickle would come through for half an hour, but now sometimes the tap stays dry all day long, that person tells the Kyiv Independent. Still, Putin persists with his lies. In the build-up to the Ukraine invasion, Putin claimed that residents of the Donbas had been subjected to a Ukrainian genocide that's killed 4 million people. The so-called civilized world prefers to ignore it, as if there were none of this horror genocide that almost 4 million people are being subjected to, Putin said in February 2022. There is no evidence of this supposed genocide, but that doesn't stop Putin from using it, along with his other fake claims, to justify Russia's attempt to snatch the Donbas from Ukraine. Putin is trying to create a narrative where he's the brave knight riding in on the white horse to save the Donbas. The terrifying thing is that Putin likely believed the tall tales he spun, which comes back to the third reason why he's so obsessed with the Donbas. To lose now would be to fail in his mission to make Russia whole again, and that's something that Putin can't allow to happen. What the Russian president fails to see or purposefully ignores is that his lies about genocides and the Donbas wanting to be Russian hide the very real damage he's caused the region. Still, Putin keeps on pushing, sacrificing thousands of his country's soldiers to the pyre of his Donbas's ambitions. The question now is, will Putin manage to get his hands on the region that he covered so much? There is talk that Ukraine might be forced to cede the Donbas as part of a peace deal with Russia. On October 19, US President Donald Trump suggested that Ukraine cut up the Donbas in such a way that Russia would control most of it. Speaking to reporters on board Air Force One, Trump said,
"Let it be cut the way it is. It's cut up right now. I think 78% of the land is already taken by Russia. You leave it the way it is right now. They can negotiate something later on down the line."
Given how much of the Donbas Russia currently occupies, that would essentially mean that Ukraine allows Russia to continue to occupy over 80% of the region. Trump apparently pushed for this outcome during a White House meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, according to The Guardian. However, it's also possible that this comment was supposed to suggest that the battle lines should be temporarily frozen, rather than used to denote the new borders of Ukraine and Russia in a peace deal. When asked if he'd asked Ukraine to cede all of this Donbas territory to Russia, Trump said,
"No, we never discussed it. We think that what they should do is just stop at the lines where they are on the battle line."
So it's difficult to determine what the US president thinks Ukraine should do with the Donbas. And now that Trump's much anticipated meeting with Putin in Hungary has been called off, the US may even believe that freezing the battle lines is no longer an option. On October 21, Trump explained that the US called off the summit with Putin because he didn't want to take part in a wasted meeting. As one European diplomat put it to Reuters, "I guess the Russians wanted too much, and it became evident for the Americans that there will be no deal for Trump in Budapest." Not that Ukraine will ever cede the Donbas willingly anyway. Zelensky said as much when the idea of handing the region over to Russia started doing the rounds in August. "We will not leave Donbas. We cannot do this. Donbas for the Russians is a springboard for a future new offensive," Zelensky claimed. "If today we leave Donbas, from our fortifications, from our reliefs, from the heights that we control, we will clearly open a bridgehead for preparing an offensive by the Russians. In a few years, Putin will have an open path to both the Zaporizhia and Dnipro regions, and not only that, also to Kharkiv." These are all regions mentioned when discussing Putin's strategic reasons for his obsession with the Donbas. Their protection is as important to Ukraine as preventing Russia from taking the Donbas. Add to this that Ukraine's constitution states that its president doesn't have the authority to cede territory anyway, and the idea of Ukraine handing the Donbas to Russia is a non-starter. So Putin will keep fighting for the Donbas. His obsession compels him. And right now, Putin's failure to take the Donbas in the time frame he believed that he could still stand as one of Russia's greatest failings in the Ukraine war. There are many others. We've explained every Russian failure in 19 minutes in one of our videos, so check it out to find how badly Putin has bungled his Ukraine invasion. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more analysis of the Ukraine war and the reasons behind it.